If this story touches your heart, take a moment to reflect on the power of resilience and love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories. It was a somber afternoon, the sky cloaked in gray as mourners gathered at the small hillside chapel for the funeral of Margaret Bennett, a beloved member of the quiet village. The air was heavy with the weight of shared sorrow, the faint rustle of trees and occasional sniffles the only sounds. Margaret's dog, Rocky, sat near the front pew, his large frame still and his sharp eyes fixated on the casket at the altar. "Rocky, no," murmured one of the mourners, reaching out to calm the dog. But Rocky moved away, his barking growing louder, his posture rigid with urgency. Whispers rippled through the chapel. "What's he doing? He never acts like this." Children clung to their parents, the tension rising like a tidal wave. Father Paul, a middle-aged priest with a reputation for composure, faltered for a moment, his voice wavering. "Let us not be distracted," he said, forcing a smile as he gestured for calm. But Rocky's behavior was impossible to ignore. He barked again, his gaze unwavering, his body angled protectively in front of the casket. One mourner, David Harris, a newcomer to the village, couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. "Father, maybe we should check?" he ventured, his voice tentative but firm. All eyes turned to Father Paul, who suddenly seemed uncomfortable. He dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, his smile faltering. "It's nothing," the priest insisted, his tone sharp, defensive. "The dog is just confused." But David wasn't convinced. Rocky wasn't confused. He was warning them. David moved toward the casket, Rocky quieting momentarily, his tail wagging slightly as if in encouragement. "What are you doing?" Father Paul's voice cracked, panic seeping through. "This is highly inappropriate." Ignoring the priest, David leaned closer to the casket, his heart pounding. As he reached for the lid, Rocky let out a low growl, his body tense. David hesitated, glancing at the dog as if seeking permission. Rocky barked once, sharp and deliberate. Taking a deep breath, David lifted the lid. Gasps filled the room as the contents of the casket were revealed, not Margaret's body, but a collection of documents, money, and valuables. Rocky growled again, his gaze snapping to Father Paul, who had gone pale. "What is this?" David demanded, his voice rising with incredulity. The room erupted in whispers, the mourner's grief morphing into shock and outrage. Father Paul stumbled backward, his hands raised in a weak attempt to placate the crowd. I can explain," he stammered. This isn't what it looks like. It looks like fraud," someone shouted. Others murmured in agreement, their trust in the priest crumbling. Rocky barked again, as if to punctuate the accusation. The ensuing chaos revealed a shocking truth. Father Paul had orchestrated the entire funeral to cover up a scheme, using Margaret's burial as a ruse to conceal his embezzlement of church funds. Rocky, ever loyal, had sensed something amiss, his instincts unearthing a secret no one could have imagined. By the end of the day, Father Paul was taken into custody, his betrayal shaking the once tranquil village to its core. Rocky, hailed as a hero, became a symbol of truth and loyalty. Margaret's memory, tainted briefly by deceit, was honored anew, thanks to her faithful companion. The story of Rocky's bark echoed through the village for years, a testament to the unyielding bond between a dog and his human and the truth that can't be buried. The heavy air inside the chapel seemed to thicken as Father Paul's nervous glances darted around the room. Rocky, the loyal German shepherd, stood resolutely, his bark echoing through the stone walls. His intense focus on the casket made the crowd shift uneasily, whispers of suspicion and dread rippling through the mourners. "Does he know something?" an elderly woman murmured, her voice barely audible but tinged with fear. Parents pulled their children closer, the once reverent gathering now shadowed by an unshakable unease. Father Paul's voice broke through the tension, strained but commanding. "Please, someone take the dog outside," he ordered. But Rocky didn't budge. He stood his ground, barking with such urgency that even the bravest among them hesitated. It was as if he were carrying an urgent message that no one could yet decipher. Among the mourners was a man who stood apart, not just in appearance, but in demeanor. David Harris, a recent arrival in the village, had barely known Margaret, but had attended out of respect. His observant eyes darted between Rocky and Father Paul. Something about the priest's uneasy avoidance of the casket and Rocky's relentless focus stirred David's instincts. He had always been drawn to mysteries, and this felt like one begging to be solved. Rising from his seat, David adjusted his coat and made his way to Rocky. His every step was watched by the crowd, their whispers growing louder. Kneeling beside the dog, he spoke softly. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to show us?" Rocky stopped barking momentarily, his intelligent eyes locking onto David's as if assessing whether he could trust this stranger. David felt a chill, as though Rocky's gaze carried the weight of an unspoken plea. Turning to follow the dog's line of sight, his eyes landed on the casket. The hairs on his neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. "Leave the dog alone," a man called from the pews, his voice sharp and dismissive. But David didn't waver. Without looking back, he replied firmly, "I think Rocky is trying to tell us something." David straightened and took a cautious step toward the casket. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a mix of fear, curiosity, and outrage. Father Paul's face paled, and he dabbed at his brow with a trembling hand. "This is highly inappropriate," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual authority. David glanced at the priest, his own unease deepening. "If it's inappropriate, Father, then you should have nothing to fear." He turned to Rocky, whose tail wagged faintly as if encouraging him to press on. Taking a deep breath, David placed his hands on the edge of the casket. Gasps erupted from the mourners, but no one moved to stop him. Slowly, he lifted the lid. The room fell silent. Inside, instead of Margaret's body, was a pile of documents, cash, and expensive jewelry. The items gleamed under the dim light, their presence a glaring betrayal of the solemn occasion. Rocky barked sharply again, as if to confirm the discovery. Father Paul stumbled backward, his face a mask of guilt and panic. I can explain," he stuttered, raising his hands defensively. "You knew," David said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You knew this wasn't right, and you tried to hide it." The crowd erupted, their grief turning to anger. Rocky stood tall, his barking subsiding as if his job was done. David turned to the mourners. She trusted him, and this is how he repaid her? The truth unraveled quickly. Father Paul had staged the funeral to cover his theft of Margaret's estate, banking on the mourner's grief to mask his deception. Rocky, ever loyal, had sensed the betrayal and refused to let it go unnoticed. As police arrived to take Father Paul into custody, Rocky sat calmly beside David, his tail wagging softly. The villagers rallied around the heroic dog, their respect for Margaret deepened by her faithful companion's bravery. Rocky became the heart of the village, a living reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. David hesitated for a brief moment, his gaze locked on Father Paul. The priest's trembling hand and the beads of sweat rolling down his forehead betrayed his composed facade. Rocky, standing resolute by David's side, let out a low growl, his sharp eyes fixed on the casket as though urging David forward. "No," David said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I won't leave, not until we find out the truth." His words sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, their unease now mingled with suspicion, while others gasped at his audacity. The air inside the church felt heavy, charged with an unspoken fear. Father Paul's face turned a deeper shade of red, his jaw tightening as he glared at David. "You dare to defy me in the house of God?" he barked, his voice cracking with frustration. "Hannah deserves peace, and you're desecrating her memory with this nonsense." David straightened his posture, his eyes unwavering. "Hannah deserves the truth, Father. If everything is as you say, then why are you so afraid? Why does Rocky act like there's something here we're all missing?" The crowd stirred again, whispers growing louder. The tension in the room was palpable. Parents pulled their children closer, and elderly villagers exchanged nervous glances. All eyes darted between David, Rocky, and Father Paul, each moment feeling heavier than the last. Before Father Paul could respond, Rocky barked sharply, the sound reverberating through the church. The dog took a deliberate step forward, his nose brushing against the casket. The people gasped as Rocky scratched at its base, his movements urgent, almost frantic. He's trying to tell us something, David said, taking a step closer to the casket. We need to see what it is. No, Father Paul shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He rushed forward, placing himself between David and the casket. I won't allow it. This is sacrilege. The crowd erupted in whispers again, the priest's overreaction only fueling their suspicion. One elderly woman in the front row stood up, her voice steady despite her frail frame. Let the man and the dog do what they must, she said. Hannah wouldn't want secrets kept in her name. Father Paul froze, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. David seized the moment. Step aside, Father, he demanded. If you have nothing to hide, let us prove it. With a trembling breath, Father Paul reluctantly moved back. Rocky barked again, his tail stiff and his eyes locked on the casket. David reached out, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Slowly, he lifted the lid, the crowd leaning forward in breathless anticipation. What they saw sent a collective gasp through the room. Inside the casket, instead of Hannah's body, lay stacks of cash, gold jewelry, and official-looking documents. The valuables were haphazardly arranged, as though someone had rushed to fill the casket. The room erupted into chaos, voices shouting in disbelief and anger. Where is Hannah? Someone cried out. Father Paul stumbled backward, his face pale as the color drained from it. I can explain, he stammered, his voice barely audible over the uproar. David turned to him, his voice sharp and unwavering. Explain what, Father? That you've been using Hannah's name to hide your crimes? That you thought no one would question you? The crowd surged forward, their anger palpable. Rocky barked again, his sharp, insistent voice cutting through the noise. David raised a hand, calming the crowd. We need answers, he said firmly. But let's not turn this into chaos. Let the authorities handle this. Just then, the church doors swung open and two police officers stepped inside, their expressions grim. One of them, Officer Mills, addressed the crowd. We've received reports of suspicious activity tied to this funeral, she said. Please remain calm as we investigate. Father Paul, now trembling, tried to step back, but Rocky barked fiercely, blocking his retreat. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing the priest as the crowd watched in stunned silence. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled. Father Paul had been embezzling funds and using Hannah's funeral as a cover for his schemes. The real tragedy, however, was uncovered when Hannah's body was found buried in an unmarked grave near the church. The community mourned her loss again, but this time with the closure they deserved. Rocky became a hero, his loyalty and instincts saving the day. David, too, was hailed for his courage and determination. Together, they proved that even in the darkest moments, truth and justice could prevail. David stepped out of Hannah's house, clutching the small key tightly in his hand. The chill in the air had grown sharper, and the evening sky was painted with shades of amber and gray. Beside him, Rocky walked confidently, his tail wagging as though he knew they were on the brink of uncovering something monumental. We're close, boy, David murmured, glancing at the key. This has to open something Father Paul didn't want anyone to find. The quiet of the village amplified the sound of their footsteps as they made their way back toward the church. The old building loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the fading light. Rocky sniffed the air, his ears perked as they approached. David's pulse quickened. He felt the weight of Hannah's letter in his pocket and the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Entering the church, the eerie silence was broken only by the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath their steps. The altar stood ahead, bathed in the dim light of flickering candles left burning. Rocky's nose dropped to the ground, his body tense with anticipation. David followed his lead, and the dog guided him toward the back of the altar. Good boy, David whispered, crouching to inspect the area. There, partially obscured by an ornate rug, was a small, rusted lockbox embedded in the floorboards. David's heart raced as he brushed away the dust and debris. The key felt heavy in his hand as he inserted it into the lock. With a soft click, the box opened. Inside were bundles of cash, ledgers, and documents. But what caught David's attention most was a thick envelope labeled in Hannah's handwriting for justice. He carefully opened it, revealing detailed records of Father Paul's financial dealings, all tied to embezzling funds from the church and laundering money. It was damning evidence, but there was more. A second document detailed a series of secretive meetings and hinted at threats made to those who questioned him. David's breath caught in his throat as he read Hannah's final note. She had written, "If anything happens to me, Father Paul is responsible. He knows I've uncovered his sins." She knew, David whispered, his voice trembling. And he silenced her. Rocky growled softly, his gaze fixed on the church doors. David turned to see Father Paul standing there, his face pale and his eyes filled with cold fury. "What are you doing here, Harris?" the priest demanded, his voice echoing through the empty church. "You've gone too far." David rose to his feet, holding the envelope in one hand. "I think you're the one who's gone too far, Father. Hannah knew what you were doing, and now, so do I." The priest's expression darkened. "You don't understand. Everything I've done has been for the good of this village." "Good?" David's voice rose, his anger spilling over. "You've been stealing from your own congregation and silencing anyone who dared to stand against you. Hannah was trying to protect this village from you, and you killed her for it." Father Paul stepped closer, his composure slipping. "She left me no choice," he hissed. "She was going to destroy everything." Rocky barked sharply, stepping between David and the priest. The sound reverberated through the church, a warning that sent a shiver down David's spine. "You're done, Father," David said, his voice steady despite the tension. "This evidence will expose everything." The priest lunged forward, but Rocky growled fiercely, forcing him to halt. At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed outside. Villagers, drawn by the commotion, began gathering at the doors. Their murmurs grew louder as they took in the scene, Father Paul cornered, David holding the incriminating documents, and Rocky standing protectively at his side. "What's going on here?" an older man asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. David turned to the crowd, holding up the envelope. Hannah discovered that Father Paul was stealing from the church and threatening anyone who found out. She left behind this evidence because she knew her life was in danger. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and people exchanged shocked glances. Father Paul's face turned ashen as the weight of the villagers' stares bore down on him. "You betrayed us," someone shouted. "We trusted you," another added. The priest stumbled backward, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. I only did what was necessary to keep the church running." "No," David countered, his voice firm. "You did what was necessary to line your pockets and protect your lies." At that moment, police arrived, summoned by one of the villagers. Officers entered the church, and David handed over the documents. As Father Paul was led away in handcuffs, the congregation stood in stunned silence, grappling with the betrayal they had just witnessed. Rocky let out a soft bark, nudging David's hand as if to remind him of the justice they'd achieved together. David knelt beside the dog, scratching his ears. "You're the real hero, buddy." Hannah would be proud. In the weeks that followed, the village began to heal. The church was restored to its former glory, free from corruption. Hannah's bravery and Rocky's loyalty became a symbol of resilience and truth, reminding everyone that even in the darkest moments, courage and determination could shine through. And for David and Rocky, their bond had only grown stronger, proving that together they could face anything. David Harris, with Rocky loyally by his side, felt the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. The diary, the photographs, and the hidden corruption Father Paul had desperately tried to conceal everything pointed to the church as the epicenter of this web of deceit. With the small key in his pocket and Hannah's diary clutched tightly, David knew the next step was to confront the truth head-on. As they approached the church, the village seemed unnervingly quiet. Shadows lengthened on the cobblestone streets, and the evening air carried a chill that seemed almost foreboding. Rocky walked closely, his ears alert and tail wagging cautiously, as if he too sensed the gravity of their mission. Inside the church, the dim light from the flickering candles cast eerie shadows on the walls. David hesitated for a moment, the weight of what he was about to uncover heavy on his chest. Shadows sniffed the air, his body tense but determined. "Let's do this, boy," David whispered, and together they stepped deeper into the heart of the church. David's eyes scanned the familiar layout, now laden with an ominous aura. The statue from the photograph stood in its usual place, an unassuming piece of stonework that seemed to hold the key to everything. Rocky moved forward, sniffing around its base. His sudden bark echoed through the silent hall, breaking the oppressive stillness. "You've found it, haven't you?" David muttered, kneeling beside Rocky. He carefully examined the base of the statue, his fingers brushing against the cold surface until he found a small, almost imperceptible latch. Taking a deep breath, he pulled it open. Hidden within was a compartment, and inside lay the metal box. David's heart pounded as he retrieved it. Rocky sat beside him, watching intently. The box was heavy, and the rusted edges hinted at its age. Using the key he'd found at Hannah's house, David unlocked it with trembling hands. Inside were stacks of documents, each one more damning than the last. Records of embezzlement, secret payments, and false charity funds were meticulously detailed. There was also a ledger filled with names, dates, and sums of money, all evidence of Father Paul's corruption. But the most chilling discovery was a letter. It was written in a shaky hand, and David recognized it immediately as Hannah's. "If you're reading this, it means I wasn't able to stop him in time. Please, whoever finds this, ensure the truth comes out. The people of this village deserve to know what he's done." David's breath caught in his throat. Hannah had sacrificed everything to protect her community. Her letter was a plea for justice, a plea that David now held in his hands. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the back of the church. David froze, his grip tightening on the box. Rocky growled low, his body tense and ready. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. David turned to see Father Paul stepping into the candlelight. "You should have stayed out of this, Harris," the priest said, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into." "Oh, I understand plenty," David shot back, standing his ground. "Hannah knew what you were doing, and she tried to stop you. She paid for it with her life." Father Paul's eyes flickered with anger. "You think you're a hero? You have no idea the sacrifices I've made for this village. Everything I've done was for the greater good." "The greater good?" David's voice rose, his anger spilling over. "You stole from the very people who trusted you. You silenced Hannah because she exposed your lies. You're no savior, you're a coward." Rocky barked sharply, as if echoing David's sentiment. The sound reverberated through the church, its power amplified by the sacred space. Father Paul's composure cracked, and for a moment his mask of righteousness slipped. "You don't understand," he hissed. "If this gets out, it will destroy everything. The church, the village, they'll crumble under the weight of scandal." "They'll recover," David said firmly, "but only if the truth comes out. This village deserves better than you." Behind them, villagers began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Murmurs filled the church as people caught sight of David holding the metal box. "What's going on?" Someone whispered. "What's he found?" David turned to the crowd, his voice steady despite the tension. "Hannah tried to expose Father Paul's corruption, and she paid the ultimate price. But she left behind the evidence to ensure the truth would come to light." Gasps rippled through the crowd as David opened the box, showing its contents to the villagers. Their shocked faces turned to Father Paul, who now looked cornered and desperate. "You betrayed us," a woman's voice rang out. "You used us." The priest staggered back, his fayade crumbling. "I did what I had to," he muttered, but his words carried no conviction. The villagers surged forward, their outrage palpable. Police, called by one of the villagers, arrived moments later to take Father Paul into custody. As he was led away, David felt a wave of relief. Justice had finally prevailed, thanks to Hannah's bravery and Rocky's unwavering loyalty. The village, though shaken, began to heal. Rocky became a beloved figure, a symbol of truth and perseverance. And for David, his bond with Rocky grew stronger, a testament to the courage it took to face the darkness and emerge victorious. Together, they ensured Hannah's sacrifice was not in vain, bringing light to a village shrouded in shadows. David Harris gripped the key tightly, his heart pounding as he and Rocky moved through the shadowy interior of the church. The air felt heavy, the kind of silence that carried centuries of secrets and hidden truths. Rocky, his loyal companion, walked beside him, ears perked, sniffing the ground with purpose. They were close, David could feel it. The metal box had only been the beginning, a breadcrumb leading them deeper into the mystery surrounding Hannah's death and Father Paul's corruption. Using the map, David made his way toward the back of the church, where an old wooden door stood partially obscured by heavy drapes. The map's markings aligned perfectly with this spot. He reached out, pulling the curtains aside, revealing a locked door with a faint symbol etched into the wood, a cross intertwined with intricate patterns that seemed oddly out of place. "This has to be it," David murmured, glancing at Rocky, who let out a soft bark as if to affirm his thought. Carefully, David inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then clicked open with a groan that echoed through the stillness of the church. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the depths of the church. A chill ran down David's spine as he stepped forward, the dim light from his phone guiding the way. Rocky stayed close, his nails clicking softly against the stone steps. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint scent of damp earth and dust filled the passage. At the bottom of the stairs, David found himself in a small, hidden room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old ledgers, relics, and crates. In the center of the room was another table, and on it lay a larger metal box, locked and engraved with the same intricate patterns as the door. David's hands shook as he placed the key into the lock. With a turn and a sharp click, the box opened. Inside were more documents, ledgers, and photographs, but these were even more damning than the ones he had already discovered. One ledger detailed the systematic embezzlement of church funds, listing dates, amounts, and recipients. Another contained a list of names villagers who had disappeared or left under mysterious circumstances over the years. Hannah's name was circled, with a note beside it, "Too close to the truth." David's breath hitched. She'd been silenced because of what she'd uncovered. Beside the papers, he found another item, a small recording device. He pressed play, and Hannah's voice crackled to life. "If you're hearing this, it means I wasn't able to stop him." Her voice trembled with a mix of fear and determination. "Father Paul has been using the church as a front for his crimes. I've seen the money, the deals. He's not who we think he is. Please, whoever finds this, expose the truth." Tears welled in David's eyes as Rocky whined softly beside him, sensing his emotions. "Hannah, you didn't die in vain," he whispered, gripping the recorder tightly. "I'll make sure everyone knows." Suddenly, a noise echoed from above footsteps on the wooden floor of the church. Rocky growled low, his body tense. David quickly gathered the evidence, shoving it into his bag. He had what he needed, but now he had to get out. He crept up the stairs, careful not to make a sound. At the top, he peeked through the cracked door and saw Father Paul pacing, his face flushed with panic and fury. The priest muttered to himself, occasionally glancing toward the entrance as if expecting someone. David's grip tightened on the bag. He needed to get past Father Paul without being seen. As he eased the door open, Rocky stayed by his side, silent and alert. But before David could make his move, Father Paul turned, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto David. "What are you doing back here?" the priest demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. David didn't hesitate. "Uncovering the truth, Father," he said, stepping forward boldly. "I know everything about the money, the lies, and Hannah." Father Paul's face darkened, and he took a threatening step closer. "You don't understand what you're meddling with," he growled. "This isn't just about me. Exposing this will destroy the church, the community. Do you really want that?" David held his ground, his voice steady. "Hannah wanted the truth to come out. And now, so do I. The people deserve to know who they've been trusting." Before Father Paul could respond, Rocky barked sharply, his protective instincts kicking in. The noise startled the priest, giving David just enough time to move past him toward the church doors. Villagers, drawn by the commotion, began to gather outside. David stepped out into the open, holding the evidence high. "This church has been hiding corruption, and Hannah paid the price for trying to expose it," he announced, his voice strong and unwavering. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Father Paul stumbled out after him, his face pale. "Lies," the priest shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. David opened the bag, pulling out the documents and Hannah's recording. "These aren't lies," he said, turning to the villagers. "Hannah left this for us, so we'd know the truth." The weight of the evidence, combined with Hannah's voice on the recording, was undeniable. As the crowd demanded answers, Father Paul's facade crumbled. Police arrived moments later, called by one of the villagers, and took the disgraced priest into custody. In the days that followed, the village began to heal. Hannah's courage and David's determination had brought the truth to light. Rocky became a local hero, his loyalty and instinct celebrated by everyone. Together, they ensured Hannah's legacy lived on, a reminder that even in darkness, justice and truth could prevail. David Harris stood in the dimly lit basement, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The faint glow of the single bulb swayed gently above him, casting flickering shadows on the damp stone walls. Hannah was there, chained to a chair, pale but alive. Relief washed over him like a wave. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "David," she breathed weakly, her eyes filled with both hope and exhaustion. But before he could take another step toward her, heavy footsteps echoed behind him. He turned sharply, his flashlight beam catching the enraged face of Father Paul. The priest held a heavy wooden plank in his hands, his expression contorted with fury. "You shouldn't have come here," Father Paul bellowed, his voice echoing ominously through the cold corridor. "You don't understand what you've done. You've ruined everything." David barely had time to react as the priest lunged at him, swinging the plank with all his might. He dodged, but the edge of the wood struck his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through him, but he forced himself to focus. How had it come to this? How could a man who preached love and kindness be capable of such darkness? Before the priest could strike again, a fierce spark shattered the tension. Rocky, loyal and fearless, launched himself at Father Paul. His powerful jaws clamped down on the priest's leg, forcing a scream of pain that echoed through the basement. Father Paul stumbled, the plank falling from his hands as he tried desperately to shake Rocky off. "Good boy, Rocky," David shouted, adrenaline surging through him. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his shoulder, and ran toward Hannah. With shaking hands, he worked to free her from the chains. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent. "He won't stop." As David unlocked the final clasp, Rocky released his hold on the priest, who now limped toward the staircase, his face twisted with panic. "Stay here," David said to Hannah, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'll be back." David and Rocky gave chase, their steps pounding up the narrow stairs. The sound of Father Paul's desperate breathing echoed ahead of them as they emerged into the church. The priest, wild-eyed and limping, burst through the front doors and into the village square. The commotion had already drawn a crowd. Villagers spilled from their homes, drawn by the noise and the sight of the once revered Father Paul in such a state of disarray. Murmurs turned to gasps as David emerged, his clothes disheveled, followed by Rocky, whose teeth were bared in protective defiance. "Stop!" David's voice boomed across the square, silencing the crowd. "Everyone needs to hear what really happened. The truth about Father Paul and what he's been hiding." Father Paul froze, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "Lies!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to destroy the church." David stepped forward, holding up the metal box and the documents he had discovered. "This isn't just about the church," he said, his voice steady. "This is about the lives he's destroyed, the money he's stolen, and Hannah, who he kidnapped to keep his secrets hidden." The crowd gasped, their disbelief turning into anger. Rocky stood beside David, growling low as Father Paul took a step backward, his eyes darting toward the edge of the square as if searching for an escape. Desperate, the priest made a run for it, but Rocky was faster. With a growl, the dog lunged, blocking Father Paul's path and forcing him to stumble. Villagers moved in, surrounding him and cutting off any chance of escape. "Enough!" An elderly woman in the crowd cried, her voice filled with fury. "We trusted you, Father Paul. You betrayed us all." The villagers, once united in their faith, now stood united in their demand for justice. The police, called earlier by one of the residents, arrived and took Father Paul into custody. His protests fell on deaf ears as the community turned their backs on him. As the police led him away, David returned to the church where Hannah waited. She was weak but determined, her eyes filled with gratitude as she looked at him. "You saved me," she said softly. "No," David replied, a smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "Rocky and I just did what was right. You're the one who had the courage to uncover the truth." In the weeks that followed, the village began to heal. The stolen funds were returned to the community, and the church was restored as a place of genuine faith and hope. Hannah, free from her ordeal, found solace in the support of her neighbors. As for David and Rocky, they became local heroes, a reminder that courage and loyalty could overcome even the darkest of secrets. Their story spread far beyond the village, inspiring others to stand up for truth, no matter the odds. With Father Paul restrained and Rocky standing guard, David Harris knew this was the moment the truth would come to light. The crowd of villagers had grown, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and disbelief. David took a deep breath, holding the metal box tightly in his hands. The weight of its contents wasn't just physical, it carried the burden of betrayal, secrets, and lies. "Everyone," David called out, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest, "you deserve to know the truth." He opened the box, revealing its contents, stacks of embezzled money labeled with the names of congregants who had given their donations in good faith, and a map marking the hidden storage room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization dawned on them. Their trust had been exploited, their faith manipulated. "We trusted him," an elderly woman whispered, her voice trembling. "He used us." David nodded solemnly and led the villagers to the hidden storage room behind the altar. Inside, they found more damning evidence, stolen artifacts, financial records detailing years of theft, and other incriminating documents. In the dim light of the storage room, Hannah sat, still shackled but alive. Relief flooded her face when she saw David, and tears welled in her eyes as she murmured, "You found me." Rocky, sensing her distress, wagged his tail and licked her hand, offering the comfort only a loyal dog could provide. David quickly released her, and she collapsed into his arms, her strength drained but her spirit unbroken. But the moment of relief was short-lived. As the villagers processed the revelations, Father Paul, desperate and furious, seized an opportunity. While the crowd debated what to do next, he wrenched himself free from the men restraining him and grabbed a broken wooden plank from the ground. His face twisted with rage, he charged at David. "You've ruined everything!" The priest screamed, his voice filled with venom. "You don't understand!" David barely had time to react as Father Paul advanced, the plank raised high. For a brief moment, fear rooted him to the spot. The surreal image of a priest, a man of supposed virtue, wielding violence against him was almost too much to comprehend. But Rocky was faster. With a fierce bark, the dog lunged, sinking his teeth into Father Paul's leg. The priest let out a scream that echoed through the square, dropping the plank as he fell to the ground. Rocky held firm, his loyalty and courage on full display as he kept the man pinned. David snapped out of his daze and rushed to help. He pulled Rocky back, but Father Paul used the moment to break free. Limping and wild-eyed, the disgraced priest stumbled toward the main square, his desperate flight drawing the attention of even more villagers. Rocky wasn't about to let him escape. Barking furiously, the dog chased him down, leaping and knocking him to the ground in the center of the square. The villagers formed a circle around the priest, their shock and disbelief giving way to anger. "How could you?" One man shouted, "We trusted you with everything." David stepped forward, catching his breath. His voice rang out clear and steady. "Father Paul betrayed all of you. He used your faith and your generosity to line his pockets and cover his crimes." And when Hannah discovered the truth, he tried to silence her. The villagers gasped as David recounted the evidence he had uncovered: the stolen money, the hidden documents, and the plot to keep Hannah from exposing him. People shook their heads, their faces a mix of grief and fury. Father Paul, pinned by Rocky and unable to escape, began to sob. "You don't understand," he mumbled. "I was trying to protect the church." "Protect it by destroying it?" David shot back, his tone sharp. "No, you were protecting yourself. The police, called by one of the villagers, arrived shortly after. They took Father Paul into custody, his protests ignored. The stolen money and documents were handed over as evidence, ensuring that justice would follow. As the commotion died down, David turned to Hannah, who was now surrounded by villagers offering their support. She smiled weakly at him, her gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. Rocky sat beside David, his tail wagging as if he knew the battle was over. David knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You're a hero, buddy," he whispered. Rocky responded with a happy bark. In the weeks that followed, the village began to heal. The stolen funds were returned to their rightful owners, and Father Paul faced trial for his crimes. Hannah, though shaken, found solace in the kindness of her community. And David and Rocky became symbols of resilience and courage, their story reminding everyone that even in the darkest times, truth and justice could prevail. The church stood eerily silent as David Harris held the small metal box in his hands, the weight of its secrets pressing down on him. Rocky, his ever-loyal companion, stood at his side, his gaze alert as though he, too, understood the gravity of the moment. The crowd of villagers gathered around, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. David took a deep breath, knowing that this moment would forever change the village. He slowly opened the box, revealing the stacks of money neatly labeled with the names of the congregation who had trusted Father Paul with their donations. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading like wildfire as the evidence of betrayal lay bare before them. "This is what he's been hiding," David said, his voice firm but heavy with emotion. "Your hard-earned money, given in faith, used to line his pockets and fuel his schemes." The murmurs grew louder, and some villagers exchanged looks of shame, guilt, and fury. Father Paul, restrained by a few men, struggled against their grip, his face red with desperation. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I did this for the church." But no one believed him now. His mask had been torn away, exposing the corruption beneath. David reached into the box again and held up the key. "This," he continued, "led me to a secret storage room in the church." The villagers followed David as he led them back to the church. Inside, the tension thickened as they descended into the hidden storage room. There, chained to a chair but alive, was Hannah. Weak and pale, she looked up as the crowd entered, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she saw Rocky bound toward her, his tail wagging furiously. The loyal dog rested his head on her lap, his presence offering her a sliver of peace amidst the chaos. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their emotions boiling over as they took in the scene. Their faith had been exploited, their trust shattered. Many wept, while others clenched their fists in anger. David worked quickly to unchain Hannah, his hands trembling but steady enough to free her. "This is what Father Paul was trying to hide," David said, his voice loud enough to echo through the room. When Hannah discovered his crimes, he silenced her to protect himself. The crowd turned toward Father Paul, who stood in the doorway, his face contorted in anger and fear. "You're twisting everything," he bellowed. "You don't understand the sacrifices I've made for this community." But his words fell on deaf ears. The villagers had seen enough. As the police arrived, called earlier by one of the villagers, Father Paul was handcuffed and led away. He screamed his protests, but the community had made up their minds. Their priest had betrayed them, and there was no redemption for him now. Hannah, now free, clung to David, her strength slowly returning. "You saved me," she whispered, her gratitude evident in her tear-streaked face. "You and Rocky." David smiled softly, resting a hand on Rocky's head. "We couldn't have done it without him." In the days that followed, the village began to heal. The stolen money was returned to its rightful owners, and Hannah shared her story, encouraging the community to rebuild on a foundation of transparency and trust. David, who had risked everything to uncover the truth, decided to stay. He became an integral part of the village, helping Hannah recover and working with the villagers to restore their faith not in a man, but in each other. Rocky became a local hero, adored by everyone. Children surrounded him, showering him with love, while adults praised his courage. He seemed to bask in the newfound attention, but his happiest moments were still by David's side. The village, once shrouded in deceit, found a new beginning. United by the courage of David and the loyalty of Rocky, they vowed never to let secrets fester again. Together, they built a stronger, brighter future, one grounded in honesty and community. And so, the story of Father Paul's fall and the bravery of David and Rocky became a legend in the village, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. The story of David Harris, Rocky, and the village serves as a powerful allegory for the importance of truth, courage, and the pursuit of justice in our daily lives. At its core, it reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing only allows corruption and injustice to thrive. David's unwavering determination to uncover the truth, despite the risks and opposition, reflects a timeless principle. Standing up for what is right is rarely easy, but it is always necessary. In today's world, corruption, dishonesty, and exploitation often hide behind facades of authority and respectability, much like Father Paul in the story. Whether it's in our communities, workplaces, or even personal relationships, we may encounter situations where trust is broken and people suffer as a result. This story encourages us to question what lies beneath the surface, to pay attention to the signs of injustice, and to have the courage to investigate and act when something feels wrong. Rocky's role as the loyal and intuitive companion serves as a metaphor for listening to our instincts and following our moral compass. Just as Rocky sensed danger and stood by David's side, we too should trust our inner sense of right and wrong, even when others dismiss or doubt us. In life, allies, whether they are friends, family, or loyal companions, are crucial when facing challenges. They give us strength and remind us that we don't have to confront difficult situations alone. The story also highlights the ripple effect of standing for truth. David's actions inspired a community to unite, confront a painful reality, and rebuild trust. In our lives, being a catalyst for change, even on a small scale, can inspire others to examine their values, take responsibility, and work toward positive transformation. The advice is clear. Never ignore your instincts when something feels amiss, and don't be afraid to speak up when you witness wrongdoing. Build your life on a foundation of integrity and surround yourself with people who encourage honesty and courage. While it may be uncomfortable or even risky, exposing the truth and standing firm in your principles can lead to a more just and united world, one where trust and transparency prevail. If this story touches your heart, take a moment to reflect on the power of resilience and love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories.